The Books Podcast, presented by Tim Hague.
Welcome to the Books Podcast. I'm Tim Hague. Now, a few years ago, Steve Richards wrote a wonderful overview of post-war British premiers called The Prime Ministers, from Harold Wilson to Theresa May. And he was kind enough to talk to Books Podcast at the time. Now, that lineup, of course, includes Tony Blair. But what with all the other incumbents of the office, we didn't get to go into great detail about him. Happily, Steve has published a punchy, detailed account of Blair as PM, and he joins us again now.
He came in when Labour was slaughtered in 1983. He was an MP when they were slaughtered in 1987. He was shadow employment when they were slaughtered in 1992. And he formed a view about how Labour could win based on that. Britain is a rotting mansion where everything is falling apart. We plan to change the ashtrays. When Labour delivered budgets which actually hit the middle classes, they got rave front pages through sheer guile. Keir Starmer absolutely struggles with all the arts of politics.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
Steve, it's great to see you again.
Thank you.
Can I throw you a curveball? I think you've known most of the prime ministers that you've written about, but I think you probably knew Blair best. Is that true?
Blair and Brown. And the more I think about it, the more privileged it was because, we as in columnists and some broadcasters, we were invited to see them on a really regular basis. I reckon I was invited in to see Blair in Number 10 about once every 2 months, the same with Gordon Brown. And I knew them before they got into power.
I mean, on a going to the pub basis even?
No, actually, no. But seeing a lot of them and them being, they were both very stimulating to spend time with. As columnists, you would spend time, say, with David Cameron and come back and there was nothing in that at all. You would leave those two in very different ways and you think, God, I've got to write this down. There was some very interesting reflections. Gordon Brown, it was more a monologue, but a brilliant monologue. He thought deeply, and I always used to look with Gordon Brown when I used to go into Number 11 or Number 10 when he was briefly Prime Minister. And I looked at who else was on the guest list that day. And it was things like the Archbishop of Canterbury, a poet, as well as journalists and economists.
And then he was slumming with a journalist.
Yeah, it was really lowbrow. And Blair was more conversational. And so those are the two by miles I've known best.
Does it make it easier or harder to write about him if you knew him that well?
Well, this far in the distance, it's easy. At the time, it was a nightmare because you would see them. They would be very friendly and, sometimes they would have drinks and my wife, Barbara, would come and Tony Blair would say, Barbara would say, I covered your first ever election in Sedgefield. And Tony would say, yeah, I remember actually, and all this. And then you'd write a piece slagging him off and feel terrible for days. But I haven't seen either of them actually for a very, very long, years and years. And so it's much easier to write as you see it.
Can I ask you about Blair as a political animal? Because he was in a strange way not your typical Labour Prime Minister. He didn't come from a sort of a tribal Labour background. So he sat slightly oddly in relation to the Labour Party when he was running it.
And that was both his advantage and I think a problem. Because it's very interesting comparing him with Keir Starmer, because Keir Starmer is steeped in the Labour Party. His parents called him Keir after Keir Hardie. So he's steeped in the Labour Party, but relatively new to politics. And he absolutely struggles with all the arts of politics. Blair was, in a very interesting way, completely different. He, by the time he became Labour leader, was steeped in Labour politics. He'd been an MP since 1983 and had been involved in endless internal battles. But he wasn't Labour. in the same way that Starmer
You
was
say in the
born
book
into
that
Labour.
he'd never sort of quote Marx or R.H. Tawney or anything.
Well,
But you said he was the world's expert on Labour losing elections in the 70s and 80s.
that's what formed it. Roy Hattersley once said to me, and he said it as a criticism. See, Blair was part of Roy Hattersley's team in opposition at one point. And Roy Hattersley was quoting people like Tawney all the time. And Neil Kinnock once said to me, Grace, Roy and I are Tawneyites. Now, Tony Blair wouldn't have read a word of Tawney. And Roy Hattersley saw this as a major flaw in Blair's makeup, which it was. You know, there was no ideologically rooted position framed by the brilliant thinkers on the left, which applied to all the kind of giants on the left and right of the Labour Party. Hattersley was seen as on the right, but he revered these left-wing writers like Tawney. And Blair wasn't like that. However, he came in when Labour was slaughtered in 1983. He was an MP when they were slaughtered in 1987. He was shadow something or other, employment.
Was it employment?
When they were slaughtered in 1992. Slaughtered in terms of votes, not seats. And he formed a view about how Labour could win based on that. Basically, and to govern. It's very interesting. Most people, when they are on the steps of number 10, have a banality, but it kind of has a wider thing. You know, Thatcher with St. Francis of Assisi, and it was nonsense. But and Johnson lying about he had a plan for social care and things outside number 10. Blair just said, we were elected as New Labour, we will govern as New Labour. And what he meant by that is there will be no return to the 70s and 80s. And if you want to understand Tony Blair, that is the beginning of the understanding. If you want to make sense of Iraq, think of what he regarded as Labour's vote-losing positions in the 80s. Anti-American, perceived as being, soft on defence, perceived as being. And there was no way he was going to be seen as that as they moved towards the hell of Iraq. So that is the way of framing Blair, his understanding of why Labour lost in the 80s.
And of course, losing a succession of elections, as Labour have recently discovered, is traumatising.
Yeah.
And that's what fed into, for instance, this business of Labour promising to respect the Tory spending plans in their first 2 years, and not putting up income tax. Promises they didn't have to make. They were going to win that election, but they were traumatised.
They were traumatised by defeat, especially 1992, where the Tories ran that tax bombshell campaign. And, you know, as Neil Kinnock has reflected so often since, their tax proposals would have benefited the vast majority of voters, and they were slaughtered because of them. So you're right, they went into the 97 election. I remember when Blair launched the manifesto, I was sitting next to the BBC presenter Evan Davis, and he said, basically, this manifesto says, Britain is a rotting mansion where everything is falling apart. We plan to change the ashtrays. And that was basically it. You know, it was very cautious. And Philip Gould, hugely influential polling guru in the New Labour era, said to me afterwards, the result was historic, this landslide victory. The manifesto was very incremental. But because the result was so mind-blowing, people kind of assumed the manifesto was more radical than it was because the result was so sensational.
And their expectations were for a changing or radical changing government. You say in the book, I haven't got the quote right here, but something like Blair and Brown should have been more arrogant. That's the word you used.
Yes.
And I do wonder if they should have ditched the promises and gone, we're going to get 2 terms here. By the time we have to face the voters properly, they'll have forgotten.
Well, I wonder whether they should have made them in the first place, like with Starmer and Reeves.
Exactly the same thing, yeah.
But Blair and Brown, were rightly obsessed with trust. It's one of the many ironies of the Blair era. He was resolved to form a relationship with the electorate, which was based around trust. And in the end, he wasn't trusted because of Iraq. And there's a sort of, a tragic arc, really, which was it began with this incredible level of popularity, which Keir Starmer has never had.
Yeah, Keir Starmer had very little honeymoon at all.
No honeymoon and a loveless landslide.
Like Wilson,
but by
you
the
compare
end,
him with Wilson.
Well,
he
Wilson
comes
is,
in with a big approval, partly because presumably the nation was just tired of the Tory government.
in the Wilson era and with Blair in 97. Though Wilson only won by a very tiny majority in 64 and then, of course, won a landslide in 66. Wilson was clever. And yeah, really another interesting comparison with Blair. But the tragic arc with Blair is by the end, he basically had to go into exile. There's a line in Alistair Campbell's diaries post Blair's period in power where he said, I can't really bear being in Britain at the moment. When he launched his memoir, he couldn't hold it in Britain. The security was impossible because he had become, in the eyes of some, a war criminal.
Also,
and
very
so
convenient.
what a contrast. But they were obsessed with trust, so they weren't going to scrap their pledges on income tax. But you were right, that was very constraining. And so and Blair's genius was to sort of say, look, we're being really radical. And do you remember that speech he made in opposition? A new country, a young country, Britain reborn.
No verbs.
No verbs. And, if you actually looked at the manifesto, it was very cautious. But he gave the impression always of boldness or with a sense of purpose. But one of the other, it's so layered and complicated because they were too cautious in many ways. But then when you look at what they did in the first 100 days and compare it with the Starmer government, to be honest, it's quite impressive. He lists in his memoir, I put it in the opening chapter, the first 100 days, and it's an incredibly long list. Minimum wage, social chapter, the start of Sure Start, where they ended up spending a lot of money on Sure Start.
Abolishing freeing the Bank of England, did they?
Independence Bank of England was on day 2. A Scottish Parliament, a Welsh Assembly. And this has always been the problem with analysing New Labour. It was both cautious, but then if you look towards the end of its time, it was change making. Look at the way London changed, not through them. They'd have been too scared to introduce a congestion charge, but they created a mayor. They tried to stop Ken Livingstone from being it, but they created it, and Ken Livingstone transformed London. But he wouldn't have had the agency to transform London without them. So it is such a complex picture, that era. And Blair is a complex figure, as well as being in some ways the most kind of politically simple of prime ministers because of that background, where he didn't get guided by the great philosopher kings and queens, and didn't have a developed sense of the past, whereas Brown, of course, did. Wrote a book on one of the great early Labour politicians, John Maxton. Now, Tony Blair wouldn't have crossed Tony Blair's mind to write a book on John Maxton. So they were very different. But as I suggest in that book, that relationship and making sense of it is the other thing you have to do to make sense of that whole period.
Well, simple question: how did he get away with it? Because you said he made the cautious sound exciting. He dressed it up as radicalism, and undertakings that added up to actually not very much sometimes. How did he get away with it? What did his enemies never point out that it was that it was slightly empty?
Well, that's a good question. Partly, and again, it becomes so much more vivid when you see this current Labour government struggle. The mastery over British newspapers was brilliant, in my view, and necessary. And I will remain an admirer of the very controversial Alistair Campbell because, when Labour delivered budgets which actually hit the middle classes, they got rave front pages on the Daily Telegraph, the Sun, and all the rest of it. Through sheer guile, and I say that in a positive way. You look at Rachel Reeves, who in some ways did a budget which will get kids out of poverty and all sorts of things. They are being slaughtered. So for Labour to get rave reviews for quite punitive budgets at times was one element. Blair himself was someone who could frame arguments and communicate. He was one of the political teachers. And the other thing is they won elections. Now, this should not be underestimated, because I think although they were far too slow and incremental, they won 3 elections. So if you compare that to the Attlee government, Attlee did brilliant things. He was gone in 6 years. Labour were in for 13 years after 97. And so over time, they did deliver quite a lot of change. But, the instincts were focus groups. And that's why the media, you say, oh, God, they're so arrogant, these people, what a swagger they go around with. They were so insecure, and Ed Miliband used to refer, he said, we're just not, we just assume the Tories rule in Britain and that we are imposters. And it was that mindset that meant that they weren't arrogant at all. They were quite insecure about their position in the political firmament. Wherever you turn, it's like studying a book, a brilliant novel. Wherever you turn, there's another side, and that makes it quite interesting.
You do make the point that unlike some Labour leaders, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were fascinated by the media. And
obsessed by
prepared. I mean, that in a way that's a disadvantage, because you're watching hour by hour how you're. But it was important because, as you say, Alistair Campbell comes in and he takes it by the scruff of the neck and decides that this is how Labour are going to get through. And I think that if the current Labour government might learn a thing or two about.
So if Keir Starmer had an Alistair Campbell figure, there's still been quite a lot of trouble, but nowhere near as much trouble as they're in. I've got no doubt about that. But they were obsessed to the point of paralysis. So the Murdoch newspapers had such influence over them, and when Murdoch was in town, there was a real neurosis between. Brown would say, when's Murdoch seeing Tony? Why isn't he seeing me first or whatever? And Brown, in the build-up to his so-called transition to number 10, was one of the top issues was, could he get the Sun on board and the Times on board? He didn't, as it turned out. But again, if you want to understand Iraq in its full, dark, layered qualities, I've got absolutely no doubt that Murdoch was a factor in Blair's thinking. And I think I put it in the book, the Sun endorsed Labour in 2005, Blair's last election, and the editorial is fascinating. We are only endorsing Tony Blair because of his foreign policy and in particular his support for the war in Iraq. And it was later revealed that Blair and Murdoch had several conversations in the week leading up to the war. So that's the degree of influence Murdoch had. And there was a phase where they hoped to get the Daily Mail on board. Gordon Brown certainly hoped to get Paul Dacre on board. But Dacre hated Blair and they realised that was hopeless. But the Murdoch press had a big influence on that government, too big an influence. They accept that now. I mean, Alistair Campbell's really interested. So, we were far too in hock to these papers.
You've mentioned Iraq, and of course, Tony Blair ended up demonized. And at the very least, people will, use phrases like "feet of clay." You think that's a really a misreading, not just unfair, not just mean-spirited, but a misreading of Tony Blair's career in Iraq.
Well, in a way, it's the most complex thing to address because it was a catastrophe. It was obvious in advance that it was going to be a catastrophe, and a bigger figure would have just stepped away from it. However, I can see how he was trapped, partly by his own character, his sense that, as we've already mentioned, the weakness of Labour in the past has been to be soft on war, soft on anti-American. So he was already in a mindset where his instinct was to always side with America and to show he is tough on defence. He was trapped, I think, by he was quite he was quite shallow in his reading of policy on lots of different areas. He was trapped by his sense we liberated Kosovo. He went over to Kosovo and they all called their kids Tony and things.
Yes.
Went straight to his head. And he thought Iraq would be liberated. That, I think, it's no doubt genuinely the
He
case.
also thought if the war was won, that the British public would sort of forget all the controversy that led up to it.
Yes.
He was just utterly wrong about that.
Totally.
The alleged dodgy dossier, which we're probably not going to be able to talk about in detail, but all the shenanigans and the compromises, he assumed, because he'd seen Thatcher come through the Falklands and be a war hero.
That was part of his mindset as well. So Robin Cook, who is a key figure and brilliantly and bravely resigned from the cabinet on the eve of war, said to me that the course for Blair to Iraq began when, after the Falklands War, Blair stood in the next by-election that was held, a safe Tory seat, and Cook went to see him to help campaign. And Blair said to Cook, it's unbelievable. She's treated like a god now because of the war, the Falklands War. And Robin Cook's theory is that was part of his mindset. And the other was this fear of the Tories. The Tories, remember, won elections with their eyes closed for much of Blair's early career. And he said to a cabinet minister at the beginning of the 2001 term, he said, he outlined as 3 objectives. And one of them was to show that a Labour Prime Minister could work with a Republican president as closely as a Democrat president. And he said, look, those Tories are in Washington all the time, and we've got to make sure they don't push
Also,
us
he'd
out.
watched Kinnock be humiliated when Kinnock was the leader of the
Very,
opposition
very big
by the
moment.
American president.
He and Gordon Brown watched that in their cramped office on some rubbish television. And Reagan gave Kinnock about 2 minutes, pretended he had no idea who Dennis
Bare
Healy
minimum
was.
required by protocol.
Bare minimum. And Thatcher, when she came, was treated like a rock star. And I think all this was in his mind with Iraq. What wasn't in his mind was Harold Wilson, who in many ways was a bigger figure than Blair, in my view, who told Lyndon Johnson they weren't going to go in with him on Vietnam. And that was a very big, brave thing to do. And Wilson's most recent biographer, Cabinet Minister Nick Thomas Simmons, who I know well, has always said he thinks that's an example of really bold foreign policy making. And Johnson was furious with Wilson, but he still did it. And Blair didn't. And so, there are all kinds of other psychological theories. He got carried away with being with Bush at all those joint press conferences. After September the 11th, he got a standing ovation because of his supportiveness for Bush. And he clearly felt he couldn't break away from any of that. So it was a trap. But there is a very interesting question. What would have happened if Blair had opposed the war, like Wilson did in Vietnam? And like Vietnam, America would still have gone in. So it would have still happened with all the catastrophic consequences. And America would have gone in without any attempt to go to the UN, whereas Blair got them to go to the UN. Not that it made any difference in the end. And if Blair had opposed it, the left of the Labour Party would have been thrilled, but there's a big Atlanticist wing who would have opposed him, and it would have still split the Labour Party, and Murdoch's papers would have turned. So although that would have been the bigger decision, he was in a trap. And I don't think people recognise that when they just say, oh, he lied, he was a war criminal. So that's the argument I try and explain in that chapter. But it's a short book. It's a series of prime ministerial biographies since 1945. And they're all short. Actually, Alan Johnson, the cabinet minister, has done one on Wilson. And Ian Dale's has done one on Thatcher. And so they're all quite short. But So there's more to be said about Iraq and the allegations made by the BBC and why they were wrong, the BBC allegations, even for those of us who opposed the war. And I knew they were wrong. So the BBC alleged basically they lied about weapons of mass destruction to justify the war. Huge allegation. And I saw Robin Cook the day that BBC report came out. And Robin Cook was furious with the reporter, Andrew Gilligan. He said, that's not the issue. That's not the issue. Of course, it wasn't, it was signed off by the senior spies, the Joint Intelligence Committee. So, of course, they weren't against it. They signed it off. The issue was, the decision to go to war, to side with America, to not explore the consequences of what would then happen. Why was the intelligence so wrong? But that BBC story was, it's hard now to remember how explosive it was, made more so by the suicide of the source of the story, David Kelly. I mean, what a drama,
There's a turning point there, though, in this Iraq business, in Tony Blair's self-image almost. You've got a quote in the book that he says, I didn't seek unpopularity as a badge of honor, but sometimes it's the price of leadership and the cost of conviction. The idea of Tony Blair going, I'm not interested in popularity, compared with the earlier part of his premiership, is almost hard to believe.
He hadn't changed at all. He was still fascinated by popularity, and he was determined to win the next election, which of course he did. But he had no choice at that point. A big moment for him was that demonstration in London in February of 2000.
Million people.
Yeah. And they were not just, he would have been wholly relaxed if it just been, a lot of Corbynistas out for a march, because he would always defined himself against the left. And but it wasn't. It was his people, Middle England people. And for a time, he had no choice but to make a virtue of his unpopularity. But I don't think it was ever a thing. However, in another bizarre twist, there's no doubt at all, after Iraq, where virtually everyone came to agree it was a disaster, he became more self-confident and assertive. It was then he started pushing through public service reforms that Gordon Brown was trying to stop. And he became absolutely self-confident and tried to impose on Brown an agenda when he left. And instead of thinking, God, maybe I'm not as good as I think I am, Iraq was a catastrophe.
Well,
he became more assertive on a domestic agenda.
Persuading himself that because he kept saying, it was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Maybe he persuaded himself that it wasn't. Being unpopular was so unusual.
Yeah, I think he persuaded himself. And in a way, to stay sane, you almost have to.
Mm-hmm. So did he stay too long? I mean, he's then trying to impose a program on Brown. Did he stay too long? He did. Certainly for Brown, he stayed too long. Because by that time, the government had spent its political capital.
Exactly.
But what about him? Did he stay too long?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I think in the end, that the intensity of that job, it means it's too long. It's too long after. America is very sensible to have these 2-term limits. But for that Labour government, so I think if Brown had come in, as he ached to do in the middle of the second term, he might have been a really formidable prime minister. So I see him as a big figure. And I think that is now becoming much more of a common view. Because if you look at how Rachel Reeves is struggling as the Labour Chancellor, he did it for 10 years, that job. And it's really tough being a Labour Chancellor. It made Dennis Healey, the most physically robust of people, ill by the end of his time as Labour Chancellor. He did 5 years. Gordon Brown did 10 years. And I think so I think he could have been a bigger prime minister. In a way, he was, because of the financial crash and how he responded. But he's a sharp reader of political rhythms, Brown, and he knew it was going to be too late, I think, by the time he got in, which was 2007. And the dance between the two of them as to when Blair was going to go sucked up their energy and the energy of all their supporters of either side. I mean, that side of it was a soap opera, but with policy implications, because I think Brown had a different idea of what reform meant to Blair. And if he had won an election, would have been quite an interesting prime minister, I think, because then you have an authority to do things that you don't if you just inherit it for a bit and then go.
You write in the book, Blair left Britain in a better place than it had been. Actually, you say it twice, at the beginning and at the end of the book. No, I thought that was rather cunningly bookended. And you can show us what that is, and you can tell us in what ways it was a better place. But I want to ask about his legacy. Is there anything left of? There's no ideological legacy. There is no real Blairism, is there?
Well, as ever with Labour governments, in some areas there are, like the social reforms. Labour governments find social reforms much easier to pull off than economic reforms. And I think I put that in the book, because they quite often get Tory support for social reforms. So Roy Jenkins' reforms in the late 60s were the titanic achievements of that Wilson government, not so much economic policy. And if you look at some of the social reforms, I mean, things like civil partnerships were the beginning of, Cameron would not have done gay marriage without civil partnerships. So that was a major social reform. We've talked about some of the other things, minimum wage, Sure Start was one of the most great things. It really did, this so-called phrase left behind. It really brought the left behind in for a bit. That was cut by George Osborne in 2010.
They put the NHS back on its feet as well.
The NHS
which was in a parlous state
was huge. And the way they did it was something that this current government should have taken note of. It was a major tax rise, but they prepared the ground and made an argument. And so when they did it, which was the budget of 2002, the Sunday Telegraph commissioned a poll hoping to find it would be deeply unpopular. And they had to put the headline, the most popular budget since the war. Because people saw the connection between the tax rise and improvements to come in the NHS. And they did get NHS spending up to the European average, whilst retaining enough support to win elections. Labour governments always put up taxes. Rachel Reeves has just done it. But it usually results in a complete collapse in support because the papers just say this is outrageous. And Labour, after the Rachel Reeves's budget, is 14% in opinion polls. Well, that budget in 2002 got sort of 50% approval rating. So they and devolution and the introduction of mayors, these are all quite big changes. I think the improvement in cities and urban areas, not towns, which became a huge problem and still is, was striking between 97 and 2010. There are things they didn't address, clearly, Europe being one of the major ones. They never put the case for Europe.
Good Friday Agreement, though, huge.
Northern Ireland, I think, was his greatest domestic achievement. There was absolutely endless obstacles to that happening, even though John Major had laid the groundwork for it. But it's forgotten that John Major really had to give up because the unionists in his party just wouldn't let him go any further. So Blair and his chief of staff, Jonathan Powell, saw, right, there's an opening here. And they played it like a symphony. They put Mo Mowlam in as Northern Ireland secretary, who was trusted by the nationalists. Blair kind of tried to reassure people like David Trimble from the unionist side. And he used Clinton very smartly. Clinton intervened at certain key moments. And it came together.
And he didn't have to fight off Gordon Brown, because Gordon Brown didn't have a big stake in it.
But Blair, one of the reasons why he enjoyed foreign policy and dealing with Northern Ireland is he didn't have his chancellor breathing down his neck. And but Brown often had cause to breathe down his neck. I mean, it was a very dynamic, never-ending, fiery conversation between them. But better that than Rachel Reeves just telling Keir Starmer, here's what I'm going to do in July, and then, oh yeah, off you go. Which is what did happen, not the most recent budget because of what happened in the past. But these two were arguing and challenging, and some of it utterly destructive, but some of it constructive. But yeah, Northern Ireland, I mean, it made sense. It made devolution make sense as well. So the Northern Ireland Assembly was not some weird anomaly, given that Scotland had a parliament, Wales had an assembly. Now, what it didn't do was, the Scottish thing was very interesting, because George Robertson, the Scottish Labour MP who was ended up running NATO, he said this would finish off the SNP. Well, the SNP has run the Scottish Parliament for about 800 years. So
we all make mistakes.
So consequences, that they hadn't fully thought through. So yeah, I do think Britain by 2010 was a incomparably better place to live in than it was. People forget what it was like before 1997. Just in London, the transport was so dire, you had no idea whether you'd get anywhere. And look at it now. And you can measure that from the introduction of a London mayor. So yeah, I do think it wasn't as institutionally radical by any stretch of the imagination as the 45 government. There was no equivalent of the NHS, and they avoided housing. They all accept that now. Virtually no houses were built. So there were big gaps, and they didn't put the case for Europe in a way that kind of sealed the deal on Europe. One of the huge disputes was over whether Britain should join the euro. And Gordon Brown stopped it, but I don't think Tony Blair would have ever dared to hold a referendum on it, because they
Very wise.
probably would have
Referendums
lost.
are fraught
Yeah.
with difficulty.
Fraught with difficulty, except Harold Wilson won one on Europe. So yeah, I do think in the end you have to say, they had enough time, 13 years, to make quite significant change. But what they didn't do was seal those changes. So Cameron came in 2010 without winning an overall majority and wiped out Short Start, got us out of Europe unintentionally in 2016. And what else? The NHS was in a dire state again. And so, whereas in 45, the changes were so deep, the Tory government accepted nearly all of them for a long time. And there was talk of, Buttskillism, Butler and Labour, and Butler Tory, Gateskill Labour, that they didn't seek to overturn a lot of 45. Cameron, with no overall majority, sought to overturn quite a lot of it.
It is, as you say, a short book, but it is characteristically trenchant, and I really enjoyed it. The book is Blair, by Steve Richards. It's published by Swift Press at $16.99. Steve, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Very interesting conversation.
Well, remember, if you haven't yet subscribed to Books Podcast, it's free. And if you want to join in the discussion, please leave us a comment. We do love to hear from you. Next time, we'll be talking to another old friend of Books Podcast, historian Alwyn Turner, has published a new instalment of his dissection of 20th century Britain, following directly on from his account of the Edwardians. This time it's Shell-Shocked, Britain Between the Wars. It's always good value.
That was the Books Podcast, presented by Tim Haig. Email Tim on tim@bookspodcast.com, Twitter @bookspodcast, and Facebook @bookspodcasttim.